Thank you so much, Irune. Good afternoon from sunny Barcelona. This is Martí Jiménez-Mausbach, Head of Research at the Ostrom Institute. As Irune said, a grassroots think tank and policy advocacy organization based in Barcelona. Thank you so much for joining us one week more at this series of online we have put forward, and many thanks also to the Mariana Institute for their kind collaboration. So, as you know, the murder of George Floyd has ignited an unprecedented global protest against racial discrimination and police brutality, which is disproportionately directed towards Black Americans and other people of color. At the same time, foreigners, immigrants, asylum seekers, refugees are increasingly being subject to discourses of criminalization in policy and legislation, in the media, and in the public debate. In Spain itself, fundamental rights have been violated, not only in the border fence, but also in the so-called detention centers for immigrants, and racial profiling has been normalized in public spaces in alleged security preventive measures. So in light of the current political climate, questions around racism, immigration, and criminal justice are more urgent than ever. And in this regard, I would like to also take the chance to mention the work of Elinor Ostrom, who gives name to our institution. And in fact, Ostrom's research on policing offers robust empirical evidence that can be pretty useful for the debates going on today. So how common are racial disparities in criminal justice enforcement? What are the connections between criminal justice and migration control? What should officials' priorities be? How should legislators tackle criminal justice issues? To shed light on some of these issues, today we are delighted to welcome four world-class experts in criminal justice, civil rights, and economy of immigration. Clark Neily is the Vice President for Criminal Justice at the Cato Institute and Adjunct Professor at George Mason University. Good afternoon, Clark. Happy to have you.
Nice to be here.
Nila Bala is the Associate Director of Criminal Justice Policy at the Institut Institute, where she helps to lead criminal justice policy areas, specifically focusing on reforms in juvenile and economic justice. Hi, Nila.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Robynn Cox is an assistant professor at the University of South California, and her research interests include the fields of crime, health, labor, and social and racial inequality. Good to have you, Robynn. Thanks.
Thank you for having me.
And finally, Joan Monràs is a professor at University Pompeu Fabra, an affiliated professor at the Barcelona Graduate School of Economics. He's also a research affiliate at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, the Institute of Labor Economics, and the Center for Research and Analysis of Migration. Bona tarda, Joan. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thanks for the invitation.
So to get started with the panel discussion, I would like to ask Clark to briefly introduce what is the current state of the American criminal justice system and what are its main challenges. We have been hearing a lot these days about immunity, and I know the Cato Institute is leading policy reform in this area, but what exactly is qualified immunity and what are its implications for policing accountability? Clark, the floor is yours.
You bet. Thanks so much. I'm thrilled to be here to talk about criminal justice today, state of criminal justice in America. I'm actually quite humbled to be on this panel. I'm not sure how I got here, but it's really exciting. I'll say on a kind of a personal note, my wife and I have two small children, and our favorite thing to do is to take them on trips, and they've seen a lot of the world. And this year we've had to cancel every single one of them. So this is the closest I've come to actually having an international trip this year. So thank you for that. The state of criminal justice in America is not good. I'll sort of explain what I mean by that. But I think I want to front load it by saying that I think that we don't have to throw up our hands in despair. There are a lot of things that we could and should be doing better than we are. I sometimes say that for me, as somebody who came to criminal justice reform a few years ago after a career in public interest law elsewhere, I look at American criminal justice and I see a vast orchard of low-hanging fruit, by which I mean so many policies, so many things that we could be doing better than we do. So things are pretty horrible, but they could be a lot better if we would just embrace some of this low-hanging fruit. So why do I say things are so horrible? I mean, it's no secret, as you alluded to, that the frustration and anger has spilled out into our streets. It was prompted by the killing of George Floyd by police officers in Minneapolis, but that was really only a spark. That was not what all of this is about. I think my belief is that the most essential problem is that America's criminal justice system has lost both its moral and its political legitimacy. It is a system that simply doesn't have legitimacy anymore. And why is that? I think there are arguably 3 or 4. I'm going to go with 4 basic reasons. The first is that we use our criminal justice system for things that a criminal justice system should not be used for. Fundamentally, what a criminal justice system does is it authorizes agents of the government to do violence to citizens who transgress in various ways. So it's a really serious thing to criminalize any particular conduct, because it not only authorizes, but really directs agents of the state to do violence to people who engage in that proscribed conduct. And we are completely profligate as a country about criminalizing various types of conduct. We criminalize so many things that should not be criminalized. Personal drug use is certainly high on the list because so many people continue to engage in that activity, notwithstanding the fact that it's a crime. But there are plenty of other things as well. And so what we end up doing is using our criminal justice system for a whole bunch of things that it's not designed for, and it really cannot morally be used for. Things like addressing mental health issues, addressing substance abuse issues, addressing issues of poverty. In America, we use our criminal justice system for all of those things and more, and it's not well designed to handle those issues, and those are not issues that should be primarily handled through that system, in large measure because the system is fundamentally one of force. And when you use force against people that have not done anything morally wrong, then you yourself are behaving immorally. So that's point 1. I sometimes refer to that as unconstitutional overcriminalization. The second way in which America's criminal justice system has lost its political and moral legitimacy is that we've moved from a system where there are a great number of kind of checks and hurdles and hoops that the government has to go through before it can convict a person and punish them, to something that is much closer to a kind of a point and convict system of adjudication. In America, everybody has a constitutional right to a jury trial when they are charged with a crime for which the punishment could be more than 6 months. But criminal jury trials in America are almost unheard of today. Why? Because we permit coercive plea bargaining. In fact, we have embraced coercive plea bargaining to the point where 95% of all criminal convictions in America come from guilty pleas. And it's important to understand what a guilty plea is in America. That means that a person has decided to waive their right, their constitutional right to a jury trial, to a process that whereby they could easily be acquitted, even if they are guilty. There's a very valuable right. They have somehow been induced to decide to waive this very valuable constitutional right and simply condemn themselves to plead guilty and exchange the possibility of an acquittal and freedom for the certainty of a conviction and punishment. The only way you get such massive numbers of people to make that choice, and I'm going to keep using those scare quotes, the only way you get people to do that on such a massive scale is through coercion. And we in America have embraced coercion, and specifically coercive plea bargaining, completely. And so that's how most criminal cases in America are adjudicated. They are adjudicated through a system of coercive guilty pleas, of coerced guilty pleas. The third thing, and I'll spend most of the rest of my time talking about it, is that all of this takes place in an environment of near zero accountability for members of law enforcement. For prosecutors, the figure is actually 0. Prosecutors are the least accountable people on the planet, American prosecutors, arguably. And American police officers are nearly as unaccountable, largely due to this doctrine of qualified immunity that I will touch on in just one moment. But I want to say, I thought there were 4 things. I'm not going to get into the 4th thing because some of my fellow panelists will. But if you fail to mention that all of these problems, all of these pathologies that I have mentioned, both take place within and also help to create a system of persistent racial disparities. You cannot possibly talk about American criminal justice without noting the persistent racial disparities in the system. Now, I know others are going to talk about that, so I won't dwell on it, but I want to make sure that I make clear that in my view, You can't have a conversation about the state of American criminal justice without talking about the persistent racial disparities in the system. And I know we're going to do that, and as we should. So real quickly, what is qualified immunity? It is simply this. It is a legal doctrine that was invented out of whole cloth by our Supreme Court that effectively transforms our federal civil rights law, which, as written, stipulates that people can sue state actors. That means anybody who's employed by a state or local government, a municipality. Under federal law, you have the right to sue anybody who violates any state actor who violates any of your rights. The actual language is that a state actor shall be liable to the person injured for the deprivation of any right. What the US Supreme Court did was it inserted effectively 2 words into that statute. So now you can only sue for the deprivation or for the violation of any clearly established right. Those words, clearly established, do not exist in the statute that was enacted by our Congress and were instead effectively placed there by the US Supreme Court. In order to satisfy that clearly established requirement, you have to identify a pre-existing case in your jurisdiction where a police officer or other government official has done the exact same thing to somebody else that was done to you, and a court has already said that's impermissible. So I'll conclude with just a very, I think, stark example. The police officer who killed George Floyd, Derek Chauvin, has been indicted for second-degree homicide in Minnesota. It is entirely possible that he could be convicted of that crime, of second-degree murder, and still escape civil liability if Mr. Floyd's family were to file a civil lawsuit against him, which they can do. It is entirely possible that because of qualified immunity, that man could be convicted of murder, but still escape civil liability. Why? Because there's not a case in Minnesota where a police officer kneeled on somebody's neck for 9 minutes until they lost consciousness and died. And if that case is not already on the books, then qualified immunity will apply and that civil lawsuit will be dismissed. And I think actually that's more likely than not. So that's a kind of an overview of what I view as the fundamental pathologies in the American criminal justice system. But let me end by saying that they are not set in stone. There is a vast orchard of low-hanging policy fruit that we could embrace and deploy to improve the system. We have simply chosen not to do it for reasons that I don't fully understand, but I think all of us are working on and trying to push those reforms into a system that is largely resistant to them. And that's my pitch.
Thanks, Clark, for this great introduction of the state of the art of criminal justice now in the state. And we hope that policymakers address this low-hanging fruit you have mentioned in the upcoming months. So moving on to Nila, what are the main institutional flaws of the current system in the US right now, and how could chances on abuses of power increase legitimacy and accountability? Should we be rethinking the work of policing, and what should official priorities be?
Sure, thank you so much for that part, Marty. I just wanted to let everyone know that my remarks sort of are influenced and enhanced by my background as a public defender. I practiced as a public defender in Baltimore City, and I was actually working in the northwest part of the district when the death of Freddie Gray took place, as well as the subsequent protests. And I am constantly thinking back to that moment because we are in many ways at that moment again where another Black man has died at the hands of police, and we're asking ourselves again, what can we do about it? So I just want to plus one everything Clark just said. I think a lot of us will be saying things that the others agree with, but I'll try to make my remarks distinct and maybe give a different sort of some different information to the same issues. But in terms of the main institutional flaws of the criminal justice system, to me, it comes down to prioritizing punishment and containment over re-entry and human dignity. So really thinking about the values that are illuminating our criminal justice system. The truth of the matter is that 95% of people who are in jail and prison will re-enter our American society. And we really need to ask ourselves, what sort of people do we want re-entering, and how are we going to include them back in the American dream and actually provide them a reasonable and valuable chance at redemption, at finding their own American dream. And right now, we're absolutely not doing that. People are often essentially facing a lifelong sentence of poverty when they exit the criminal justice system, even if it's just an arrest record or a minor criminal justice record, because so many employers, in fact, 9 out of 10 employers are using background checks, 4 out of 5 landlords use background checks. And right now in the American criminal justice system, and I think this is a contrast to other systems where there is more forgiveness, there is a policy of setting aside convictions one day. And that's not necessarily the case in America. And if we are sentencing close to 1/3 of our population that has criminal justice records, so this lifelong stigma, this scarlet letter that they always have to bear, then I don't think we're doing a very good job of centering human dignity in our criminal justice system. The other place that you can see the fact that our values are misaligned or skewed is the way that we've incentivized different actors in our criminal justice system. So if we truly believe in these values of human dignity and preserving public safety and making sure individuals can reintegrate at some point back into society, then we really have to question the way we've built the incentives. And I mean at every point in our system. So from police being rewarded when they have more arrests, when they go after fines and fees and minor crimes instead of policing violent crimes, to judges being incentivized to detain people and give them high cash bails because they don't want their name in the front page if something happens, to prisons being incentivized to fill up beds because that's how they're reimbursed, to probation and parole officers being incentivized to actually, and I've heard this from my clients, keep quote unquote good people on their caseload because they're easier to manage, and violate quote unquote difficult people or bad people so they go back to prison so that their jobs are easier. So you can see these misaligned incentives. And I think that's a significant institutional flaw in the American criminal justice system. Now, Marty, you asked me a few other questions, and I'm going to try to get to as much as I can. When we talk about rethinking the job of police, we really have to ask why we keep seeing Freddie Grays and George Floyd's happen over and over again. And I mean, you as well as me probably see many different accounts or possibilities or issues from police training or lack thereof to holding police accountable, which Clark talked about with the qualified immunity doctrine. Another issue is needing to demilitarize police, because right now our police force in America looks a lot more like a military than a community police force. They have military weaponry, they have military armament, and in fact, most of the community is often very fearful of police. So those are all issues, but I again want to take a step back and just focus on a value since we don't have too much time to go into every single detailed solution, and just say, I think there's been a huge breakdown of trust between police and Black and brown communities, as well as police and immigrant communities. And I know that some of the other panelists are going to highlight those issues. So when we're rethinking the job of police is to keep us safe. It is to look at those violent crimes and try to solve them. And I'm glad I have police that I can call when, something really terrifying has occurred to me or my family. But right now, that's not what police seem to be focused on. There's been a complete breakdown in trust because again, this is from accounts of my clients working in Baltimore. Police are doing too much and also not enough. We're asking too much of them and we're asking too little of them. It's both. Their role in the community right now is often my clients tell me they don't come out and try to solve the violent crimes that we need them to solve. They don't seem to care about the murders and the rapes and the significant crimes that Black and brown communities are faced with, but they are always there, policing the corner streets for low-level drug offenses and things like that. And that's the same thing with, with immigrant communities. Immigrant communities have lost faith and trust because they're scared that they're going to be deported. And in fact, in one recent survey, 60% of respondents said that if they knew their city was working with ICE, they were less likely to report a crime. And so those are things that we need to keep in mind. We want our police and our communities to work together. So we have to really look at what a community policing model could look like. Right now, trust is completely broken, but we have to start somewhere in building that up. Finally, I'll say in terms of officials' priorities, I just want to say one thing, which is I think right now there's a lot of attention on policing, and I think that's a good thing. But I would urge officials and legislators and criminal justice advocates to think about this moment as more than just about policing, because racial disproportionality affects every part of our criminal justice system, and we can't just focus on policing. It starts as early as preschool, when Black preschoolers are more likely to be suspended or expelled. So that school to prison pipeline starts very early. There are issues in the juvenile justice system. There are issues with reentry. And there's so many different things we could do. So I think it's a great moment because, as many have said, it's an opportunity that everyone is kind of looking at our criminal justice system. So I would say let's take that opportunity and look at many of the low-hanging fruit that Clark mentioned that we can try to reform.
So thanks, Nila, for raising these crucial points. I believe increasing trust, legitimacy, and faith should be the cornerstones of reform in the upcoming future. So, Robynn, delving into the intersection of race and criminal justice, are racially biased policies eroding the fabric of those communities police are actually trying to protect? And what is the impact on economic opportunities and social mobility? You believe individuals back into society in a fair and equitable way?
Yes. Thank you, Martí and the Ostrom Institute, as well as the Instituto Juan de Mariana, for inviting me to be a part of this discussion today and for your thoughtful questions. I want to sort of tie in with what Nila and Clark were discussing, the racial component of this. And I think even with what I talk about today, you'll hear the overlap in all of these, in sort of all of these different perspectives, or actually overlapping perspectives. So for over 50 years, civil unrest has often taken place due to confrontations between citizens and police over apparent discriminatory practices and the use of state-sanctioned violence. In other words, the horrific abuse of power that the world witnessed with the murder of George Floyd, an unarmed Black man, by 4 Minneapolis police officers a few months ago has actually been taking place for decades and was the impetus for civil unrest in the 60s, just as it has been today. In fact, the Kerner Commission was established to understand the origins of the civil unrest in the 60s, and according to their report, one of the major factors was an abrasive relationship between the police and the Black community. So once again, over 50 years later, we're asking ourselves the same thing today. For many marginalized groups in the United States, the police are not viewed as an institution that provides public safety, but instead as a tool of social control to maintain the current status quo and social hierarchy. Ronald Weitzer has discussed the problem of police corruption and brutality in the United States and purports that because of the nature of policing, officers often develop a thin blue line mentality that places them as the barrier between chaos and order, which can lead to a grander feeling of purpose and abuse of power. When you couple this mentality with the racial history of the United States, how Blacks have typically been viewed as less than human and often vilified in society, it becomes easier to understand the duality in American policing and the criminal justice system in general. That is largely based on race and secondarily class. At the same time, police are here to enforce the laws and policies of society. And if these laws explicitly, for example, think about Jim Crow laws, or implicitly, think about war on drugs legislation, take away the civil liberties and rights of marginalized groups, then yes, these policies will also undermine the ability of police to protect and serve these segments of the population. It is important to note that these laws and policies can be colorblind and at the same time racially biased in their implementation. For example, the Edward Burns State and Local Law Enforcement Assistance Grant, which I've done some research on, is one of the primary funders of the war on drugs, and is also racially implemented in sort of a racially selective enforcement type of way. sentencing disparities between crack and powder cocaine is another example, and other policies such as cash bail, which is actually quite coercive when we think about the plea bargaining and 95% of cases being pled out. You should also think about the cash bail system. So all of these have disproportionately impacted minoritized communities, especially Black Americans, and are examples of seemingly colorblind policies that were not necessarily race neutral in their implementation. Note that many argue from a statistical discrimination perspective, where Blacks and other racial minorities are inherently viewed as the main criminal element of the population, disproportionately contributing to crime. This argument is often used to justify policies of racial profiling in policing and or other racial disparities within the criminal justice system. Racial profiling as a quote unquote policy is especially nefarious in our country, in a country like the United States with a long history of slavery and oppression predicated on race. Racial profiling based solely on crime statistics takes an ahistorical perspective of the issue and doesn't take into consideration racial bias in policing and consequently how that might also impact the distribution of the crime statistics. And it also allows for continued abuses of already marginalized groups. One of the main problems is that in general, the United States has decided to use the criminal justice system to address problems stemming from racial oppression, lack of investment in historically oppressed communities, and historical economic inequities. This has increased the contact of historically marginalized and oppressed communities with the criminal justice system and ultimately places too much emphasis on short-run solutions to inequality and too little emphasis on long-run solutions, such as racial economic justice, which, by the way, Dr. King was fighting for when he was killed. Economic justice that would ensure better employment, greater earnings, and closing the racial gap, possibly even through a policy like reparations. This is why many are calling for a disinvestment in the criminal justice system and increased direct investments into minoritized communities. Remember, within the theoretical underpinnings of the economics of crime, we can choose to invest in positive incentives or negative incentives to deter crime. Positive incentives would improve the economic opportunity set of individuals in order to improve their legal earnings potential, which is the opportunity cost or what is given up to participate in so-called criminal behavior. On the other hand, choosing to invest in negative incentives does not necessarily help the individuals out of the circumstances that may have led to their participation in socially unacceptable behavior, but instead only seeks to deter crime through increasing the cost to committing those crimes, such as increasing the probability of detection, the probability of conviction, and the severity of punishment, which we've seen through the mass incarceration policies that began in the 1970s, this more punitive approach to crime. In fact, placing emphasis on these negative incentives may actually lead to greater criminality in the long run, given that contact with the criminal justice system worsens economic opportunity and social mobility. Since the 70s, as I mentioned previously, we have witnessed in the United States an experiment in mass incarceration that has been extremely harmful for marginalized communities, especially for the Black community. And we've seen the negative effects of placing too much focus on these negative incentives, how that can impact individuals and communities. These policies, like mass incarceration policies that disproportionately impact already marginalized communities, will have intergenerational effects that not only impact the individual directly involved, but also their families and children. In addition, these effects extend beyond just economics to health consequences. Something else that is now receiving quite a bit of attention as it relates to the overarching power of the carceral state is legal debt, which some of my other panelist colleagues have discussed as well. Even though many individuals involved with the criminal justice system come from poor, marginalized communities, we have seen examples of local municipalities that have used the criminal justice system to generate revenue through legal fines and fees. This system places additional financial strain on the individuals and families involved with the system. Many families with incarcerated loved ones also end up going into thousands of dollars of debt to stay connected with their loved ones and to help them with their legal troubles. Overall, I hope what I have conveyed here is that the system is broken, as we've discussed, and it operates differently based on your race and socioeconomic status. Therefore, we need to rethink the entire system and really understand its role in perpetuating racial oppression and inequality. We need to address the parts of the system that allow for it to push so many people through the system who are disproportionately from historically marginalized groups at every level, not just the police who are the first responders. We need reform at the prosecutorial level, the judicial level, and the punishment level. We also need reform at the societal level. Remember, society is who passes and agrees with these laws that are passed that have these disparate impacts on different communities. At this time, I don't necessarily have time to completely lay out all of the policies I'd like to, but I do have a book chapter with Washington Center for Equitable Growth that discusses many policy issues, and hopefully I'll be able to discuss some of them as we continue with the panel. And so the book chapter is called Overcoming Social Exclusion, Addressing Race and Criminal Justice Policy in the United States for those who are interested, but I do hope I get a chance to address some of the policies here today.
Thank you so much, Robynn, for this interesting edition. We'll make sure we post the link to this forthcoming book. And thank you so much for highlighting the importance of transitioning from a fundamentally punitive criminal system to one that increases liberty and opportunity. So, as you've mentioned, the George Floyd scandal takes place in the midst of a political scenario in which immigrants, asylum seekers, refugees are increasingly subject to discourses of criminalization in both policy and legislation, and in the media and the public debate. But Joan, what are the economic consequences of immigration flows? How do labor market regulations impact their social and economic integration? Is there any relationship between legal status and criminal activity of immigrants, and what are the differences between bigger and smaller cities?
Okay, so let me start by saying that those are difficult questions to answer in a few minutes, but let me at least try to convey how we can perhaps think about them. The first thing, what are the economic consequences of migration? I think perhaps a good way to start thinking about this question is thinking about the different groups involved in the host economy. And by this, what I mean is thinking a little bit about immigrants and how different ways in which host economies treat immigrants may affect how they integrate, how they behave, how they perform in the host economy. Second is how the host economy or how the economy treats natives that perhaps compete in some jobs or compete in some housing, etc., with some of these immigrant workers. Are there ways in which the host economy can help this type of workers? And third, and that's perhaps the largest group, is to realize that many natives enjoy consuming whatever these immigrant workers bring into the host economy, and many other natives are good complements to the skills that many of these immigrant workers bring to the host economy. Okay, now, so those are the three broad groups, and it's hard to put exact numbers on what is the consequences in terms of welfare or in terms of wages, etc., to each of these three groups. Let me just mention a few of the dimensions where I think it's important to think. First, when thinking about immigrants, I think there's typically the policies that are put in place to think about or to deal with migration may impact typically immigrants in at least three different ways. First is there's a bunch of different policies that are put in place to affect the size of immigrant flows. Is it that depending on these policies, which have a myriad of different aspects, from enforcement in the border to paperwork that immigrants need to do, to what we've seen recently, temporary closures of visa programs, etc. Okay, so those are the first types of policies, and these policies are what get most of the attention. However, I would like to emphasize two other types of policies that perhaps are as important as this overall flow of immigrants. The first being there's many countries thinking about what is the composition of these immigrants that are coming into the host economies. I'm not gonna, so I think that there are many discussions about this as well. I'm not gonna touch so much on those either. What I'm gonna touch about a little bit more deeply is what are the types of policies that help to accommodate these immigrant workers that move into host economies, and in particular for two main reasons. The first one is how fast immigrants enter the labor market, how fast they are able to work, how productive they become in the host economy crucially depend, for instance, on whether they're documented or undocumented workers. And there's some research that I've done with variation here in Spain, where I precisely document this aspect, whereas unexpectedly following the attacks in Atocha in 2005, the government legalized close to 1 million undocumented workers. And what we see is that these workers start to work in better paying jobs. They start to move more inside the territory. They can move from initially high immigrant communities to lower immigrant communities, perhaps a sign of disintegration into the broader economy. So I would just like to point that treating or putting policies that treat immigrants well in this respect is just one way to make these immigrant workers assimilate more quickly into the host economies. The second aspect that is important in this respect is more how this affects their behavior relative to criminal activities. And to this, I'm just going to point out to a paper by Paolo Pinotti, which basically uses a variation coming from when is it that immigrants that were applying for legal status, there's a point where some got these legal documents and some didn't. And by comparing these two groups of immigrants, he documents a big impact on reductions in criminality of these immigrants that got access to the legal status. So bottom line of this type of policies is treating well immigrants is a big step towards making them better workers and also better citizens in this respect. The final things that I would like to emphasize is that when thinking about the natives' perspective, perhaps the biggest concern is those set of workers that may be negatively impacted by immigration, perhaps in the labor market, perhaps in the housing market. In this respect, all that I'm going to say is that most of what we know in terms of the evidence available is that if there are effects on native workers that are closely competing with immigrant workers are typically short-lived, in the sense that particularly in the US, there's good evidence that local labor markets adapt very well to inflows of immigrant workers. And perhaps in that respect, there's some European countries with perhaps some legislations in the labor market that don't help this absorption of immigrants into the labor market. The final thing that I'm going to point out is that when we think about the immigration, and that's related to some research that I'm currently doing, is that it's fundamentally an urban phenomenon. Cities in the US and cities elsewhere typically pay higher wages and have higher housing costs. And what this means is that if, as an immigrant, and perhaps something that defines someone as an immigrant or that's strongly influenced, is that part of what you earn you're consuming back in your country of origin, then you have an incentive to move into and locate within the host economy into a high wage, high price location rather than a low price, low wage location. What this means is that thinking about immigration is also thinking about urban policies that help accommodate these immigrant workers into these big cities. And that necessarily means thinking about the housing market and thinking about how policies in the housing market help immigrants make it into these big cities, but also natives stay in those big cities that tend to be high productive locations. And I'll leave it here.
Thank you so much, Joan, for such a comprehensive review of the research on the implications of immigration for the labor market, welfare, even urban planning and housing. So before moving on to the Q&A, I'd like to ask the four of you to wrap up with a final question. How do you believe this public debate will impact legislation and policy reform? And what key ideas or principles should guide policies related to criminal justice and migration control in the upcoming months or years? We might start with Clark.
Yeah, thank you. So it is a difficult question to know exactly where to start, because that question necessarily turns on, I think, 2 points. One, where would it be the most effective to start? But second, where is it most politically feasible to start? And those aren't necessarily the same thing. There is a great deal of discussion going on right now in America about police accountability, about trying to address things like excessive force and the propensity for American police to use force when they don't need to, including particularly lethal force. And so I think that from a kind of a sense of where the most political momentum is, I think it's probably there right now. And so we have been focusing our efforts, and I think when I say we, I mean my colleagues at Cato and others within the criminal justice reform movement, have been kind of going with that current, trying to harness some of that energy and do what we can on the accountability side. There's no magic solution to any of this, but as I alluded to earlier, I do think that there are some sort of fairly low-hanging fruit type reforms. And one thing that's very encouraging is that the proposal to completely eliminate qualified immunity seems to be gaining significant traction in our Congress. So this is actually an issue that can be addressed at the federal level by the legislature. There are a number of people in Congress who've expressed a strong desire to address the qualified immunity issue. Now, to be clear, eliminating qualified immunity isn't going to sort of transform our system overnight. I don't think there's really any policy response that will do that. But I think it'll do two things, I think, if we're able to get rid of qualified immunity. First, it'll send, I think, a very strong signal that this time we really are serious about achieving fundamental change. The other thing it'll do, I think it will help to give us a better handle on the sort of the scope and nature of the problem. We know there's a problem with police violating people's rights and using too much force, but we don't have, I think we lack sort of a comprehensive set of information about that. I don't think getting rid of qualified immunity will completely fix that problem, but it will certainly increase the amount of information that we have available, because litigation turns out to be a very powerful tool for generating information. We have a very robust civil discovery process in the United States, and it enables people to get a hold of information, things like recordings from police body cameras, internal reports that otherwise wouldn't be available. And this will give us, I think, a much better sense of the sort of the total scope of the problem. This is just one of the many problems that we face, but there's a lot of energy right now, sort of within our electorate, to address this particular issue. And so that's where I think our efforts are likely to be largely focused, not exclusively, but largely focused for the next few months at least.
Thanks, Clark. Shall we to Nila?
Sure. I just, again, want to echo everything Clark said, that there's lots of reforms that I wish would occur, but I do think in terms of what's politically feasible at this moment, a lot of it is going to center around policing. I also want to say that we've already seen some changes in the last few weeks. There have been at least 5 school districts, for example, that I know of that have reevaluated their policy about having school resource officers, which are police officers that actually are within the school. So some schools have, said we're not going to continue that practice, which to me makes a lot of sense given the research and the evidence, which is that these school resource officers don't actually make these schools safer, but they do increase disciplinary actions and that school to prison pipeline that I described earlier. So schools that have these school resource officers are more likely to have, especially Black and brown kids, entering the juvenile justice system for what would otherwise be categorized as normal adolescent misbehavior. So we're already seeing a lot of states introducing legislation to do many of the things Clark mentioned, holding police more accountable, creating more transparency, moving funding around, which Robynn mentioned. So maybe taking some funding that had been previously allocated to police and putting it in community support, mental health, social services. So a lot of jurisdictions are already looking at that. I also want to mention that all of this is happening against the backdrop of a deadly pandemic, unlike anything we've ever seen. And that also is part of the current debate. It's also part of the current political climate. And one thing that I think COVID-19 has created sort of experimental conditions for in our criminal justice system is to really force our officials to ask themselves, why do we detain and imprison so many people? And do we really need to for public safety? We've seen drops in many jurisdictions about regarding admissions of people coming into jails and prisons. And places that are looking at this issue intelligently have released a lot of people. And I think that's just going to show us in the long term that we don't need to be imprisoning as many people in the American justice system as we do. There are 2 other reforms that COVID-19 has led to, which again is interacting with the death of George Floyd. So it's creating this interesting moment, I would say, in American history. One is suspending fines and fees. Many jurisdictions have done that because of COVID-19. But again, I think and I hope that there might be some long-term implications that we'll see that going after poor marginalized communities for fines and fees is not effective. It's not effective as a public safety strategy. It's not effective as a fiscal strategy. And then the other thing that's been an interesting result is a lowered and decreased detention of people who are violating technical conditions of probation. So not committing new offenses, but maybe missing curfew or missing an appointment with their probation officer. A lot of probation agencies that we talk to are saying we are not immediately taking these people to court and imprisoning them for these violations. Again, I think there might be long-term implications that we can see. We can really change the face of community supervision and do it safely. So I'm hopeful that both of these events will actually lead to some long-term changes that we really need to see in our criminal justice system.
Thanks, Nila, for this take-home message. So moving on to Robynn.
Yes, thank you. And, I want to say that, ditto to everything Nila and Clark mentioned as well. But I also want to highlight the importance of race and society's perceptions of race and the long history of race in the criminal justice system in the United States. I mean, at one point, freed slave labor was recouped through the carceral system. So I think in order to really make segue into this system, we need to take a hard look at society and our perceptions of race and how they intersect with criminality. So one, in addition to the very practical criminal justice focused reforms, we can't forget that society also agrees with Nila and Clark mentioned political feasibility. That's society. And so we have to address how to make these reforms, all of the reforms that are necessary, more politically feasible. And I think part of the way to do that is through a re-education in this society on the history of race. And actually, this is something that Martin Luther King called for before he was murdered, was that whites should re-educate themselves about the history of African Americans and the history of oppression, because it's going to take that as well to properly bring about economic justice for African Americans. And so I want to reiterate that here, that we need a true education program, possibly a K through 12 program in public schools and even colleges, that centers on teaching individuals the true history of race in the United States. So that's one place I think we need to start to address these issues of feasibility. Another is not to forget that there are federal programs that have influence or have provided incentives for state and local officials to operate in certain ways. So we need to review these programs and understand whether or not these programs are causing more net harm than good. So we need to do a cost-benefit analysis of these programs. I have a paper with my colleague, Jamie and Cunningham, where we looked at the Edward Byrne State and Local Memorial Grant Program. There's also have been other papers on the COPS programs, which is what funds the school resource officers, and all other work on, for example, the 1033 program, although not as it relates to race, and how that impacts communities. So I think we need to take a hard look at federal programs that might be providing incentives for the criminal justice system to operate in certain ways as well. And we also need the federal government to encourage and promote policies that work against the dehumanizing effect of racial biases, and development of programs that produce empathy towards others. And this should also address some of the immigration issues as well as it relates to immigration and policing, because I think they're also intricately connected there. And as part of this strategy, these policies should address racial biases, not only just in the criminal justice system, but also their root causes and how different aspects of society, such as the news media's reports of criminals and victims, how that might perpetuate certain stereotypes, for example, overrepresenting African Americans and Hispanics as villains and overrepresenting whites as the heroes or the victims of crime, for example, because that impacts public perception. I've already talked about an audit of federal crime control programs and policies in order to understand the impact on historically marginalized groups, and encourage state and local governments to do the same, and then defund programs that inadvertently lead to greater net social harm, that increase racial disparities or that have a disproportionate burden on historically marginalized communities. And economic opportunities and investments should not happen on the back end through the criminal justice sector. I've done some work as well on working while in prison and its impact on labor market outcomes upon release is sort of within this reentry framework. But why is it that individuals can find work while they're incarcerated, but they can't find work prior to being incarcerated? So we need to sort of rethink when and how we're willing to spend this money. We would get a better benefit if we spent it on the front end, and for example, early childhood education programs or employment opportunities for youth, for example. And we also want to think that we should think about, Nila mentioned our use of incarceration and whether or not we need to use it for all of the different crimes and quotations that we incarcerate individuals for. We should think about whether we should have a moratorium, for example, on incarcerating individuals for nonviolent offenses. And again, this depends on, is the net harm greater than the the good that this incarceration does to society, and especially incarcerating low-level nonviolent offenses. And finally, another program I've talked about, another policy option I've talked about is tying federal funding of criminal justice programs to states' eradication of disenfranchisement laws. And this actually disproportionately impacts African Americans. Even though African Americans' right to vote became protected by law with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the racial disparities in felony convictions suggest that they disproportionately bear the burden of felon disenfranchisement laws. And through these laws are effectively losing their right to vote. So we need to really think about that and how that impacts who's in office and the types of policies that we get, because if the folks who are most impacted by these policies are the least likely to be able to change these policies because of laws such as felon disenfranchisement laws, then we're just going to be perpetuating the inequality that we see in society, and it will be much harder to promote change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robynn, for bringing these key policy ideas and references to the table. So let's move on to Joan to end this round.
Yes, well, I'll touch only on migration policies briefly, and in that front, I think I'm perhaps less optimistic than some of the interventions before some of the prior interventions. And the reason for that is very linked to COVID, right? And I think that unfortunately, the policy response is going to be overwhelmingly, it's going to be clearly restricting migration across many countries and that's going to last for as long as COVID lasts, right? And so it's not going to lead to a comprehensive reform of migration policies or a systematic way on thinking about the flows of immigrants that host economies can accommodate, the composition of these immigrants, or the policies towards the immigrants that can help them both integrate and become citizens and fully integrate into the system. So in that sense, I'm quite pessimistic vis-a-vis migration reform.
Thank you so much. So I believe we have a few questions posted on the YouTube channel and social networks. So Irune will be picking up those. Irune?
Thank you so much, Martí. Yes, I'm going to make you one question for each one of you that I've been collecting from YouTube. So the first question is for you, Clark, and I assume that this question was about your first intervention, because this person says, that's interesting. How can cases be ruled or created in those areas if there is qualified immunity in place? It seems like a catch-22 and huge loophole.
Yeah, it's a great point. Just to maybe reformulate the question to make sure we're all on the same page, this is a question that does come up, and that is, well, if you have to point to a pre-existing case in order to show that the right in question is clearly established, how does that pre-existing case ever get made? And the short answer is this. The qualified immunity analysis is a two-step process. The first question is, were your constitutional rights violated, yes or no? The second question then is, if yes, then was the right that was violated clearly established? Now, up until about 12 years ago, courts would take that in the sequence that you would think. So they would answer that first question first. They would say whether or not there was a constitutional violation because of what happened in that particular case. And only then would they move on to the second question. But the Supreme Court handed down a case, I think it was in 2006 or 2008, where the Supreme Court said that the lower courts could approach that or apply that framework in whatever order they wanted. And of course, it's a lot easier when you've got a novel fact pattern, it's a lot easier to say, well, putting aside the question of whether or not what happened in this case represented a constitutional violation, we can certainly say that it has not yet come up, so the right in question is not clearly established, and that's sufficient to answer this case. And it turns out that courts increasingly do it that way. In other words, courts increasingly take the easy out and do not answer the question of whether a constitutional rights violation occurred. They simply go to the second and easier question, whether the right at issue was clearly established. Usually the answer will be no. And the thrust of that question is exactly right, which is that this has a tendency to cause the development of the law to stagnate. And in fact, some lower court judges have picked up on that exact point and have said, that this creates this perverse situation where a police officer can engage in conduct that we all agree represents a constitutional violation today. But because we don't hold that, because we skip to the second part of the analysis, the exact same thing can happen tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next, ad infinitum. And so it's just one of the many kind of perversities of the qualified immunity doctrine, that it creates a situation where the law does not develop, or it develops much more slowly than it should. And people can have their rights violated in exactly the same way over and over and over and over again. And it's one of many, many reasons why we've got to get rid of qualified immunity. So thanks for that question.
Well, thank you so much for this clarification. I have another question. Well, another person has another question about the war on drugs. This question is for Nila. And the question is, what are the implications of drug policies with regard to the Black community?
So if we look at the laws that have developed over, again, the last 50 to 100 years, they may appear to be race neutral, but they're not. The drug laws themselves are not race neutral, and certainly the way that they have been implemented in our communities is not race neutral. We have research and evidence that suggests that drug use between, white individuals and Black individuals is not significantly different, but of course we see significant differences in how they are policed and how they are punished. So to the first point as to whether the laws themselves are always race neutral, they're not. We know this from crack cocaine. That's the example that, most people are familiar with. But in terms of the way that it's policed in our communities, the police presence in Black communities, for example, in Baltimore, is significantly different than the presence in neighboring counties like Howard County or Baltimore County or Montgomery County, richer, more affluent, white neighborhoods. And, that has trickle-down effects through all parts of our criminal justice system. If a white individual is smoking some marijuana, or even is in the presence of cocaine or heroin, they might be more likely to be offered a diversion program or go into a drug treatment program, and maybe not even have a conviction or an arrest record for that matter, depending on the police officer who encounters them, or maybe police isn't the first person to encounter them and they actually get help before that moment. But unfortunately, in Black and brown communities, that's not the case. And in so many cases that I saw when I was a public defender in Baltimore, these were very small amounts for personal use. And these were individuals who certainly had a drug issue and probably needed treatment. But what they didn't need is the criminal justice system and incarceration, and to just be in this vicious cycle where they were repeatedly just building up a criminal justice record without any true intervention or assistance to deal with the root issues. And for many of these individuals, the root issues could be related to trauma, to poverty, to lack of opportunity. So it's a complicated question, but I think those are some of the implications that I'll list.
Well, I think you explained it very well. So thank you so much for pointing this out. We have another question, this time for Robynn. And the question is, prisons are also usually located in rural towns where they serve as a source of employment for the white community. These towns and their borders lobby states to build more prisons. How do criminal justice and labor markets interact?
Right. So I also talk about this more in depth. I have a my Economic Policy Institute article talks about this a little bit more in depth, and they do interact, and they do lobby for employment. These towns that that have seen manufacturing, there's an interaction between manufacturing plight and then trying to figure out how to sort of restore employment. And prisons were seen as a way to do that. And especially there was federal funding for building prisons as well. And so you would see congressmen lobbying for prisons, for money where prisons could be built in their town as an economic growth strategy. Now, the research suggests that this was a very poor economic growth strategy. And in the end, in the long run, it doesn't lead to economic growth. But the question is spot on, where these policies, where there has been lobbying by certain communities that have seen decreases and declines in employment due to declines in the manufacturing sector, who have sought to replace that with jobs in the criminal justice sector and specifically prisons. I also want to respond to the war on drugs question, because the research I mentioned earlier in terms of the Edward Bernstein Local Memorial Law Enforcement Assistance Grant, that is the major funder of the war on drugs. And so we do find in that research that racial disparities in drug arrests, and in particular drug sales arrests, actually increase after local agencies receive funding from the discretionary aspect of that particular grant. So I just also wanted to mention that as well. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. Sometimes it's important to highlight what you cannot easily see. So thank you so much again. And well, last but not least, we have one last question for you, Joan. And the question is, what are the effects of legalizing undocumented immigrants in crime rates?
In
crime rates.
So that so it's not my area of expertise. So I'm more of a labor economist. So here I would defer the question to basically looking at some of the amazing work that Paolo Pinotti is putting together, some work by Giovanni Mastroboni that looks at some of these issues. My reading of these papers is basically that when you give more opportunities to people, they reduce the amount of criminal behavior, right? And there's clear evidence for that using what we call good identification strategies. It's solid evidence. And that type of philosophy behind policy reform and how it impacts criminal behavior, it also applies for the labor market, right? The more opportunities you give to people, the better they can work and the more productive they are, and the better is usually for the host economy.
Joan, I don't know if you maybe wanted to add something to the question about the labor market in the prisons and the relationship. Maybe it's more related to your file.
So I did not know about this lobbying, but it's certainly things that are worth taking into account, right? So what are the there's a big sorting in the US in terms of the racial composition, and that sorting is true both inside cities, something that I've looked more into in my research, but also across cities. And so it's something that it obviously needs to be taken into account, right? There's big disparities in how big shocks like import competition or other types of shocks that affect very disproportionately different parts of the territory is affecting different communities, right? And how these different communities are trying to cope with these labor demand shocks. And obviously, there are some that may be using lobbies or opportunities that are perhaps not in the interest of the overall economy, but more in the interest of these local communities, right? And so there's at least some thought behind how much weight to put into helping certain local communities, but also not losing a global perspective on what's perhaps most convenient for the country.
Well, thank you so much.
So, I believe we will leave it here. Thank you so much, Robynn and Joan, for this enlightening discussion. I believe we covered quite a lot, and it was great to have insights both from perspectives of fellows working at academia at BF and USC, as well as professionals working in two of the leading things in criminal justice reform, which are the Cato Institute and the R Street Institute. Thanks also to those who followed us on social networks and YouTube channel. We'll be posting this video also on our YouTube channel. So yeah, I would end up by saying that anyone concerned with liberty and equality before the law ought to be centrally concerned with ending criminal injustice, racial discrimination, and restrictions. So thank you so much. Stay home and stay safe.
Thank you. This was a wonderful panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.